Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Classical Academy Podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips, and what a treat tonight. My guest is Miss Sarah Carty, Chair of the Trinity Math Department, former Dean of the Cincinnatus House. She's been here at Trinity for 8 years, and I heard, Sarah, an interesting tale about how Atherton proposed. And would you share that with us so I can see if this really happened the way I heard it?
Yes, sure thing, Mark. He proposed to me in church. It was right after I had to sit through 3 whole services. We were serving, or I was serving in some capacity. Over those 3 services. So needless to say, I was really tired and hungry by the time the end of the 3rd one rolled around. So yes, he asked me to marry him. At the end, the pastor said there needed to be a benediction. And then he called a meeting for some quote unquote family business. And my future husband went up and proposed in front of the entire congregation and God.
Wow. So very wise of him. So you're in a physically weakened state, serving in 3 services, and then he has you in front of the whole service, including your pastor, and there's God, of course.
Of course. Yes.
And what'd you say?
But what would anyone say in front of God and their church family? Of course, I said yes. Oh. Yes, I think it was before the term hangry was coined, so I was in the clear.
Oh, fantastic. Well, give Atherton a high five for me when you get home.
Oh, for sure.
So we're going to be talking a little bit about a guy named Euclid and his elements, his axioms. Don't let that word scare you, folks. You're going to be fascinated by the end of this broadcast. So first of all, who was Euclid?
Not much is known about him. He lived during the ancient days of classical Greek. He was not much is known about his life, but he lived in Alexandria, Egypt. We'll put him at around 300 BC.
Okay, so we study his elements. We study Euclid's elements here. Big overview. The catchphrase, why do we study Euclid's elements? I mean, 300 BC, come on.
Well, he was a teacher. He had his own school. And like any good professor, he was not into materialism, and he wrote a couple of books.
Wow.
So why do we study those books? Euclid's Elements, I'm afraid it's sometimes a misnomer that he wrote it. Mm-hmm. He was more of an editor or a publisher of all of these ideas. He put them together, and he put them together in a beautiful, I don't want to not give him credit, because he put them together in a beautiful fashion that's very logical and considered the gold standard in logical reasoning.
Right. Wow. Now, so we bring this into the classical setting. What relevance is it in a classical school? What's the classical application, the purpose of Euclid's Elements in a classical setting?
Sure. So Euclid's Elements, like I said, it's held up as the ideal in the logical mathematical reasoning. And so geometry courses, students are expected to first mimic his logical thought. So that's kind of the grammar stage. And then they advance to independently developing a reasonable argument, so the logic stage. And then finally in the class, they present the argument, so something from the rhetoric stage.
So the grammar stage is basically looking at his logical arguments, and I know there's some assumptions in there. We're going to talk about that in a second. So they're basically starting kind of almost where he was finishing. They're memorizing what he logically put forth and then learning how to apply them. And then the rhetoric stage, they're actually taking them for their own creative ideas, or creatively approaching math problems, or
Yeah, an application to other problems, so they can
Right.
students can determine other truths based on the truths that Euclid has.
So
put
it's far
forth.
beyond just math. Obviously, it has great relevance to philosophy and culture at large.
For sure. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Greeks were way into this.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
because they started applying it to the natural sciences and philosophy and politics. Yeah.
So I get you. You sort of answered it, but so he wrote/edited the Elements. So what was his main purpose in doing that?
His main purpose was to build arguments. So he starts off in the Elements by writing down all of these definitions. What is a point? What is a line? What is a circle? What is a square? So he starts off with these definitions. Then he puts in place what are called postulates. And then he puts in the axioms, like you were talking about. And so with these three groups of thought, of ideas, he's then able to extrapolate or determine logical truths based on just these few ideas.
So axiom, postulate, those are kind of exotic sounding words. Is assumption a good substitute, or is it sort of an assumption? What is an axiom? What is an axiom from Euclid? What's he doing there?
In short, it's a self-evident truth.
Ah, right.
So to say that 2 points make a line is, you don't have to prove that. We can all agree on that. There's no argument about it.
So when we start talking about lines, we know what a line is based on what is self-evident.
Correct.
Right? Okay, good. So that brings me to another question, and that is the importance of Euclidean geometry. Why is it so important? And really not just in math, not just math and science, but as you said, philosophically, culture at large. Why is studying the elements so important?
I don't know that it's particular to just the elements, but mathematics is very important in studying, let's say, philosophy. It gives us something to hang our hat on. So we can start comparing two things because we have words and ideas that spring from math. So you can compare something as larger than something else. And so if we're going to talk about better or greater than, we can hang our hat on the idea of something as maybe larger than something else, or smaller than something else, or maybe the relative relationship of one thing to another thing.
Right.
So to quote, I like this quote from Nicomachus of Grassa. He wrote a book called Introduction to Arithmetic, and he says, any attempt at philosophy must start with the mathematical subjects. They are the bridges that take us from the senses and opinions to the mind and understanding, from the concrete and familiar objects to immaterial and eternal abstractions, from matter to soul. So the Greeks are looking at what would a perfect circle look like? What do we know about a perfect circle?
Right.
And then drawing those conclusions, we can maybe look at an imperfect circle that I just drew in the sand and talk about it too.
Well, that's fantastic, because I know in the history of science, what brought about the birth of modern science was this desire to mathematize the observations. That's what the big breakthrough was. Obviously, peaking at Newton's work, and then later Einstein's work. So I can see how that would all go back to these assumptions, these postulates, these axioms of Euclid, of that which is self-evident. Well, after the break, what I'd love to do is talk about the effect it has on students. What questions should we be asking ourselves? Should we be asking the students about Euclid? So stay with us, and we're going to get into some real pragmatic applications right after this break. Welcome back to part 2 of our podcast with Sarah Carty. Listen, if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and give us a review. Please share the podcast with any friends or family who could use a friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. Also, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us at podcast at trinityclassicalacademy.com, podcast at trinityclassicalacademy.com, or on social media at the Classical Academy Podcast. Tell us what you liked. What do you want to hear more of? We would love to hear from you. So we're back with Sarah, and we mentioned this exoteric word axiom, these self-evident truths, 2 points make a line. From these axioms, what happened? What did he do? I think there were 5 basic axioms. What did Euclid, where did he go once he had these self-evident truths?
So it's a great building structure. There was definitions, and there were these axioms and postulates, and then he starts talking about these propositions. The first proposition being how to construct an equilateral triangle, and then he starts building and building, and so there are more and more and more propositions that he is creating, and every time he creates a new one or proves a new one, he can use that one to prove another. And it builds and it builds. And book 1 is lovely because it ends with the proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Wow. So I just beautiful. Find it quite beautiful. But he has 13 books altogether in the elements, and they're not all geometry. Some of them do speak to algebra, but algebra in a geometric sense, since the algebra as we know it now with the Cartesian plane and everything, that had not been created yet or discovered yet. So it's an amazing compilation.
I just think it's fantastic because you can use all kinds of analogies. You can see the axioms as a foundation to a building. You can see them as the central plot line of a great meta-narrative. I mean, there's so many ways to apply this and so many ways that it can shape the human mind. And that brings me to a couple of questions. The first one is this. If possible, I would love to hear an example of how an axiom spreads out and reaches into higher truths, higher social truths, even divine truths that don't stay limited to the world of math. Do you have something like that?
Sure. One of the axioms, things equal to the same thing are also equal to one another. And one of I like the movie Lincoln, and one of the scenes has Adam Driver, who is Kylo Ren, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's a character, and he's talking to Daniel Day-Lewis, who is Lincoln.
Right.
And actually, I should say the other way around. Daniel Day-Lewis is talking to Adam Driver, and he mentions this axiom, and he talks about how this drew him to the conclusion that all men are created equal, and what drew them to the Civil War. Now, whether or not that actually happened, I don't know, but
it sounds feasible when you think about the mind of Lincoln.
And it is true that Lincoln studied Euclid's elements, and it formed his law arguments.
Wow. I mean, come on, folks. Are y'all getting this? You seeing how classical education integrates reality? I mean, my goodness, this brings us to the students.
Yes. One of my other favorites. Can I do another favorite?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So another favorite of mine is things coinciding with one another are equal to one another.
Things coinciding with one another are equal to one another.
And so that reminds me of the Trinity, right? We have the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. They coincide. They're all equal.
Yes.
So these are things that we can pull from and think about even while we're doing math, and even while we're developing our logical structure in our mind.
And you think about Trinity, there's there's 3, and look where the first book ends, the Pythagorean theorem, triangle. I mean, this is not divine coincidence.
Oh,
this is God.
Yeah.
This is God.
Yes.
so now we're here we are at classical education. Now, how does studying Euclid, how does studying him and his axioms, his ideas, his proofs, how does this actually shape the students?
Well, aside from the fact that it's a pretty crucial cognitive process that students need to develop, and it increases their ability to think abstractly at an appropriate age when their brains are ready to handle it, it also provides them an opportunity to work through some virtues in humility and perseverance. So, I think math in particular is uniquely suited for the humbling experience. So
yes, you bet.
Yeah, and so the Elements is a beautiful masterpiece that we can try and emulate. Much like learning how to be a good artist, you want to look to the masters. You want to try and copy what they're doing.
So you parents, you brothers, you sisters, you cousins, you aunts, you uncles, you grandparents, encourage the beautiful narrative of Euclid with your students. And let's talk to them out there. What kind of questions should they be asking the students about Euclid? What would be some relevant questions to get into this discussion and see the beauty of what's happening here at Trinity through this study?
Well, so I had an experience a few years ago. I was teaching 10th graders through Euclid's Elements, and it was my first time teaching Euclid's Elements. And part of their final actually was to reconstruct several of the propositions. It wasn't all of them, but there were several that I pulled from, and they were so proud of their work when they turned it in. And part of my instruction was there can't be any eraser marks, so they had to construct it. They had to practice, and they had to construct it in a beautiful, perfect manner. And it was something they were very proud of. In fact, I had to access a student's work the other day, and he went into his attic, and he and his dad dug around for a while, but they found it. And he still remembers that activity and the impact that it had on what he thought of math.
I mean, it's a new language. It's a new approach to absolute truth. It's a new way of doing a narrative. I want to take Euclidean geometry all over again now. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, this has inspired you to look into Euclid yourself, right? I assume we can get translations of the Elements. Yeah,
for sure. Public domain, there are loads of copies of it, and there are some even that have questions that go along with it. And
get it going out there, folks. Grab yourself a good read, and it will warm your soul. I think this is beautiful stuff.
It's good. It kind of hurts a little bit, but it's good hurt.
Yeah, you bet. Well, listen, thank you so much. This has been very inspiring. I mean this in all sincerity. I'm going home tonight, and I'm reading some Euclid. I really am. I'm going to do it when I get home.
Proud of you, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us here on the Classical Academy podcast. This is presented by Trinity U. It's a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petre is our audio engineer, and he provides our original music. Until next time, let's all continue to grow in wisdom, in virtue, and in a love of God. Thank you.